제2세션은
We're going to begin the session number 2. The session number 2 is on the effects of international sanctions on North Korean economy and the humanitarian aid. And mostly it will be about the humanitarian conditions and the inter-Korean cooperation, how it is affecting the North Korean relationship and their conditions. And now from Washington, Professor Ki Park will have a presentation, and Director Chung and Secretary General Lee will have discussion. So 20 minutes for the presentation and 10 minutes each for discussion. So we will first hear from Ki Park, professor from the Harvard Medical School. So he is the North Korean Program Director of the Korean American Medical Association. Hello? Hello, good morning. Shall we start?
네, 시작해 주시면 됩니다.
Yes, please, 20 minutes.
Yes, first of all, let me just say thank you to Chairman Kang. I'm a big admirer of him and his organization, Sonoso. And this is an important topic. And so thanks for organizing this wonderful seminar. And I really learned a lot from the previous speakers on the economic impact of sanctions. And this session, as you pointed out, is about the humanitarian impact. And I will have a slightly different approach and not so much discussing on the actual impact of the sanctions, but some of the forces that are controlling the sanctions. And I think there might be some pathways out of it. So the outline of the talk is first, I want to talk a little bit about who are the main actors, their interests and their strategies in achieving their interests. And then talk about who is responsible for the population of North Korea. And then the impact of US's hostile policies. And then and I want to go back to US. I'm a US citizen, even though I'm Korean, and then talk about present day, and then some recommendations for ROK at least on the humanitarian sector as it regards to the sanctions. So this is not obviously something that's really written down in stone, but this is my perception, and please take it as is. So North Korea, in my opinion, their main interest is security, national security, and regime survival. And I think this is more important to them than economic development. And we see this now with the COVID-19. They went into a shutdown knowing it will have massive implications on their economy, but they prioritize regime survival and national security. And their strategy prior to the pandemic is really to defense, invest in the strong military, and hence the program, the nuclear and the ballistic missile program. Now, if you look at the US prioritizes US's national security. And to me, they have prioritized security over peace. And I'll tell you what I mean by that, because security and peace really are the two sides of the same coin. And because we all want, at the end of the day, peace. But US's strategy is really through pressure. Whether it's military pressure, economic pressure, and now we're talking today about sanctions. And North Korea calls them hostile policies, and we all know that. But that's, but it's the same thing in the US's eyes. It's the US's maximum pressure strategy to try to convince North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons, right? And that's the pathway to peace, by having North Korea give up their what they consider really their only insurance against invasion. And then for South Korea, it depends on the regime and the government in power, I think. But right now, Moon Jae-in administration prioritizes peace. And this is sort of his flagship objective. And inter-Korea cooperation. At the end of the day, Korea is one people. And people in North Korea are Korean people. Sometimes they're actually family members. So it's important for people in South Korea. They have a sense of kinship, and they want to help those that's less fortunate on the other side of the demilitarized zone. And South Korea also wants to develop economically, and it has done that in a spectacular way. But their strategy is engagement and diplomacy. For instance, right now, the big push is for the end of war declaration. Now, US, even though they want peace at the end, doesn't support right now outrightly end of war declaration because it doesn't jive. It's not in alignment with their pressure tactic. They see this as sort of a gift, to the North Koreans. And then for South Korea, there is a certain amount of US ROK cooperation. It is something that they have done for decades and they continue to do. And this is becoming problematic, especially in the humanitarian space. And I'll get a little bit into it in a bit. So let's talk about humanitarian space and what do the interests mean for the three main actors. For North Korea, the actual provision of humanitarian aid by international actors, they're ambivalent. They're not desperate for humanitarian aid. And I'll tell you why. Currently, the amount of aid that gets into North Korea pre-pandemic, before they shut down their borders, was around $30 million a year. That's about $1 per person per year. This is not really that dramatic type of aid that North Korea will prioritize. But in response to having international aid workers in the country, it is a big administrative burden for them. So at some point, the paltry amount of international aid, humanitarian aid, may no longer justify allowing the international staff to be in country. And in fact, you saw that with the COVID-19, all the international staff left, and North Korea is not desperate to have them come back. So I think from a humanitarian aid point of view, North Korea is take it or leave it. They're not desperate for aid. And also, there's this philosophy of juche. They don't like handouts. And no one likes handouts from a pride standpoint. North Korea prefers more solidarity. For instance, they would rather co-finance projects rather than be a recipient of aid. They don't want to be beggars, and they don't need to be beggars. In fact, they have co-financed vaccines for decades with the Global Alliance for Vaccination. They don't mind paying for things that they need. And then, of course, the current sanctions directly impact the ability of North Korean government to take care of their people. Not only does it cripple their economy, as we just saw in the last session, but it also prevents North Korea from importing parts for their medical equipment, sometimes medicine themselves, some raw material, joint ventures with medical pharmaceutical companies, all kinds of issues as far as taking care of their health needs of the North Korean people. Now, from a humanitarian aid standpoint, South Korea is in a very interesting position. I think South Korea is conflicted on one hand by the desire to assist North Korean people, right? Because we have this, the kinship with them. But at the same time, they're shackled by this ironclad ROK US alliance. And then the US expects pressure. So here we have this really mutually exclusive objectives. One is engagement. The other one says, no, we need to apply pressure. And South Korea tends to respect the international rule of law, including UN Security Council sanctions. Now, I will note that China and Russia have openly flouted the sanctions and to help North Korea. And they're both members of the United Nations as well. Now, on the US side, there's been some shifts. First of all, it's no doubt that US has offered humanitarian assistance to North Korea. From North Korea's side, they don't like to take aid from those who are actually sending sanctions because they said, just remove the sanctions, we can take care of ourselves, right? So they're causing these sanctions and saying, oh, let us give you some humanitarian assistance. It's something that they just don't like. And because of the pandemic, the US has become increasingly defensive about the unintended impact of sanctions. Now, I would like to just point out that this phrase unintended, the consequences of sanctions, I think we should point that out, that particular phrase is probably a well-crafted propaganda. We should not use unintended consequences because they're intended. They know what these sanctions will do. And when they put in unintended consequences, it really says, well, we're not really meaning to do any harm, but it happens anyway. They know. This is the main stakeholders as far as humanitarian aid goes and their interests. So there's this narrative: who is actually responsible for the population, the vulnerable population of North Korea? So I will tell you, North Korea actually takes full responsibility for its population. Now, at least as far as the health is concerned, but economic sanctions are preventing them. As I mentioned, they abhor offers of aid from those who are actually sending these economic sanctions. To them, they're saying, remove the sanctions in the first place. We're happy to take care of our own. I will tell you, in the health sector, North Korea has maintained, from best of our estimates, their public spending on health around 6.5% of GDP every year, despite the increases in their military spending, and despite international sanctions. And they have developed their own CT scanner. They've developed their own artificial knee joints, despite the sanctions. So there's clear evidence in my mind that North Korea continues to invest in the health of their people. Now, U.S.'s narrative is North Korea will divert funds from humanitarian aid and use it to prop up the regime. Or the U.S. is also saying, why doesn't North Korea use their weapons program money and then use it to feed their people? And that justifies economic sanctions. And I think we have to be careful that we don't allow this kind of narrative to continue, because North Korea, I think, is doing the best they can. They can do more, but they can, in the context of current unfinished war on the Korean Peninsula. I would also say that Japan is pretty clear that their position is, let's cut off humanitarian aid to North Korea. And I know from personal sources that they were the ones that led the Global Fund to cut off their funding for a TB medication program in North Korea in 2018. And this was at the peak of the maximal pressure era in 2018. And US backed that, but it was Japan-led. US went along with it, and then the Global Fund pulled out of their North Korea, $10 million a year, about 100,000 people that were on life-saving tuberculosis medications. There's a happy ending to that, in that they did restore the funding a year later. Now, from the ROK side, as I mentioned before, there's that sense of kinship. This is our people that we need to take care of. So let's talk about US's hostile policies. It's the harshest sanctions in history. There's a banking channel currently that's not working at the moment. It's cutting off humanitarian aid funding and affects humanitarian aid and North Korea's ability to care for its people. So let's get to the U.S. domestic politics. U.S. is somewhat split on how they see the U.S. should approach North Korea, especially humanitarian situation. On one hand, this is an op-ed that I wrote and said, hunger in North Korea is devastating and it's our fault. And this was a direct response to the elevating sanctions in 2017. And this was in the New York Times, and they published it. This is on the right side, an opinion piece from Gordon Chang. And Newsweek published this 1 week ago. And what he said was, we should not give food aid to North Korea because it props up the regime, and that regime will starve its own people. So this is Newsweek is a very well-respected media outlet here in the U.S., but you can see that you have voices on opposite sides, and it's actually very split down. Now, what's happening in the Capitol Hill? Very interesting. We have representatives like Brad Sherman from California, who actually sent a letter to the President of the United States, signed a letter saying we should end the war on North Korea. Right? And then he had to sign with 22 of his colleagues from Congress. And that was sent in November 8th of just last month. Just last week, Representative Young Kim, who's a Republican, she and 34 of her colleagues signed a letter telling the Biden administration not to declare the war over because it's a gift for the North Korean regime. So you can see the politics in the U.S. playing out. However, the voice in favor of peace, favor of humanitarian aid, I think is getting louder and louder, and we're building momentum. So, we have published from our research lab things where we estimate the number of people that we think could have died as a result of sanctions in North Korea. That was run by Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative newspaper. There's a number of op-eds that we've been writing, opinion pieces, that says that we need to do something about these sanctions because it's killing and harming innocent people, women and children. There are senators who are introducing bills to make sure that humanitarian aid is continued despite these sanctions. So the Senator Markey and Representative Levin are leading that process. And then, of course, 2 years ago, the pandemic hit. And these sanctions were never designed to operate in the pandemic era. And to ask for permission to send PPEs and testing equipment, that's the current mechanism for getting humanitarian exemptions. That makes no sense, but that's still in process. And we pointed that out to the US government. So US government in response, instead of opening up their exemptions process and saying it's okay and we'll just give a general license, they responded by saying they will expedite requests quickly, but I think that still it doesn't make any sense. As I mentioned earlier, the Global Fund did go back to North Korea, almost a $42 million grant for tuberculosis and malaria work, which is finally, there was pressure from Japan and US. Global Fund relented, but then they came back and said, we're going back in, which is the right thing to do. And this was from pressure from civil society groups like myself. So I'm going to end with some recommendations for South Korea, because I think this event is really happening for the audience, South Korean audience, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial. I hope that's okay with you. So I would say ROK should consider decoupling humanitarian aid for North Korea from US ROK alliance. And I'll tell you what that means. I'm not saying get rid of US ROK alliance, period. That's not what I'm saying. The military alliance, political alliance, they all stay. But in areas of humanitarian assistance, there should be a decoupling, because it's the interests and strategies are conflicting. And I would say ROK could generously fund the appeals from UN agencies and NGOs that work inside North Korea. They could actually play a leadership role and convince allies, other countries, to increase humanitarian aid funding, use their soft power, use their diplomacy. They can even insist that North Korea receive its fair share of international aid. As I mentioned before, they get $1 per person per year. You look at Vietnam, which is far richer, they get $80, $90 per person per year of international assistance. Why should that be? And then we should lead the effort, South Korea can lead the effort to challenge the harmful effect of sanctions, not just talk about it, but really effort to modify the system that's in place at the UN, international unilateral coercive actions, and fix this problem once and for all. And in conclusion, I mean, we don't need permission to help our fellow Koreans. We should never have to ask that from anyone. These are our people. We want to help them. We should never have to ask for permission. Thank you very much.
네.
Thank you very much, Professor Park. It's really interesting and also very helpful. And thank you for saving our time, like a couple of minutes. Thank you very much for your great presentation. So let's move on to the discussion. First, we will hear from Director Jung Dae-jin, Peace Center, Han Peace Institute, please. 10 minutes. Thank you, Professor Park, for your great presentation. I think my comment will be very similar. As we know, the sanctions against North Korea is a case in point that represents the peculiarities of inter-Korean relation and universality of international relations manifesting themselves on the Korean Peninsula. While the ROK tends to interpret and impose the sanctions against North Korea on the level of their purposiveness in the view of the peculiarities of inter-Korean relations, international community, including the U.S., and also tend to focus on strict implementation and the effectiveness of the sanctions on the level of the legal certainty. So that's the stance of Republic of Korea. But the U.S. look into this whole unique features and the legal certainty of the sanctions. So that's really creating tensions. So in this regard, I think the U.S. hold a key here and what they think and what's their take and how we can leverage that in a way that doesn't create any conflicts and tensions, and we can operate or implement the sanctions as it was or to fit its purpose. So what about the U.S. now? So one key parameter was the Treasury review that came out October, and I watched the video in the Congress, and it's not like it doesn't seem that it's been welcomed by the U.S. And for 9 months they reviewed, and it was kind of degenerate, and the bipartisan position was that it was not really much of a big deal. And when you think about this sanctions on North Korea, we expect to the sanctions to fulfill the purpose. However, from both sides of the Congress, they want to enhance the sanctions against North Korea. So the U.S. is now holding the key here to solve the problem. So how can we reconcile that or align that in ROK? So we need to look into this and what's going on, and responses and feedback from the U.S. Well, the humanitarian crisis should be prevented, and for that, the U.S. also cares about that. After the Treasury review, I looked into the conversations coming out in the U.S., and they want to modernize the sanctions. For example, they want to build the infrastructure and digital. That's also one focus. And also, for the sanctions, there are the other negative impacts on like the humanitarian crisis, and they want to prevent that. And that's another thing that was highlighted. So the sanctions should meet the essential needs of the people, and the whole purpose of the sanctions is not to do that. And the legal humanitarian aid also in line with the values that are upheld by the United States, and they want to show that and demonstrate that to the world. So given this perspective, the South Korea has joined the international community for the sanctions and the inter-Korean dialogue, and trying to build mutual trust and grasp opportunities for cooperation in an effort to set in motion a virtuous cycle of denuclearization, peace regime, and improvement in inter-Korean relations. So the peace and democracy need to be upheld, and the U.S. is playing a role. We agree to that. But also, we need to take a smart and flexible approach to the sanctions to North Korea, and we need to make change so that we can be creative and flexible in changing the behaviors of North Korea. That also needs to be emphasized. And the Treasury review this time, it also emphasized this negative correlation between the sanctions and the humanitarian crisis. So to fix that, the U.S. need to think about the effectiveness and the whole purpose of the sanctions, and also the ally, the ROK, will do its part. That was also announced, and the North Korean humanitarian crisis is also attributed to or is caused by the sanctions against North Korea, and that should be also highlighted. But indeed, in reality, it's not really easy to relax these sanctions. So as we review the sanctions, we may keep it for a while, but we should make sure that it doesn't affect the humanitarian aid by having close conversation with the United States in the meantime. And as a part of that, the end of the war declaration has been mentioned, but when you look at that in reality, it's not really that feasible. And for North Korea, for example, the trigger for the U.S.-North Korean dialogue, we want to use that, but North Korea doesn't see much benefit that they can get out of the declaration. So, whether they will change or whether they will have a new perspective in terms of the dialogue, well, maybe not. The declaration may mean something, but it's too premature. And also, it may not be able to be used as a trigger for the DPRK-U.S. dialogue. So we need more practical solutions for the dialogue. For example, we may open up a liaison office, But that also has some political symbol, and we need to also work on the different interests, and that would not happen in the short term. And on the other aspect, the USAID office opening in Pyongyang, for example, for the humanitarian aid, the U.S., not just North Korea, they are imposing these sanctions in North Korea. And with these whole sanctions from the U.S. and the international community, they don't want to be blamed for any humanitarian crisis. So opening up an USAID office in North Korea can be one thing, and they can open up the channel for the cooperation and the further dialogue, and they can look into the opportunities for further cooperation. So that proposal can be one good way for them and to make a breakthrough. And when Professor Park make a comments later, I would like to hear your thoughts on the feedback or the public opinion in the U.S. So with this whole recommendations to the U.S. and to operate the whole programs is also important, but we need to also make some changes in Korea. We are sending out the medical supplies and helping them to modernize their farming communities, and we are working hard for the humanitarian aid. But in terms of the vitamin cannot be sent to the North Korea because of this whole strategic materials, because it can be used as a trigger to develop the nuclear materials. So vitamins cannot be sent to the North Korea, or people are now a bit cautious and careful. So I'm not sure whether how many million tons are being sent to the U.S. Or North Korea, but still, anyway, we are too much sensitive and too much careful about sending out this one. So they had the 6 nuclear tests in North Korea, and we couldn't stop that. We know that. But sending out vitamins, they are on the strategic material watch list, and we are too much careful about sending out this whole vitamins. Well, we should ask that ourselves as well. So that's it for my discussion.
감사합니다.
Well, thank you. That was quite the interesting suggestion. So the U.S. government can give actually unconditional the offers for the negotiations and unconditional cooperation. What is the actual meaning of that? So U.S. aid and the U.S. government, and actually they have the various programs like the vaccine programs. So the North Korea will fully understand the intention of the United States if those programs are really implemented. And also regarding humanitarian aid and inter-Korean relations should be further improved. So for the next the question and the discussions, and we are going to invite Mr. Lee Ju-sung. He is a Secretary General of the Korea NGO Council for Cooperation with North Korea. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lee Ju-sung, as introduced, and it's very nice to meet Professor Park. You give the innovative and creative ideas all the time. So thank you so much. I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to Director Chung Dae-jin as well. Thank you for sharing your insightful ideas. As the Professor Park said, the North Korea has the survival issues. So in order to resolve these survival issues, and as insurance, the nuclear program is necessary to North Korean regime. But with the single nuclear program alone, the North Korea cannot survive. They cannot guarantee their survival. So in the diplomatic scenes and the political scene, the nuclear program can be negotiation tools. But when it comes to the support from the North Korean people, the other tools are required. That's why the Kim Jong-un will make the various efforts in order to win the heart of North Korean people. So various policies have been implemented. And ever since 2010, the landscape in North Korea has been changed greatly. And in the year 2014, there was a suggestion from North Korea. So the humanitarian cooperation can be made between South and North Korea. That was offer made by North Korea in the year 2014. And also international, the inter-Korean cooperation, the business cooperation can be made. As Professor Park said, the North Korea does not want to receive the unilateral aid. And actually, North Korea want to have a joint project and the joint programs in order to develop their own economies. And that is quite encouraging. For the last 25 years, there have been unilateral aid from Korea and international community. So there has been some fatigue regarding this. But actually, North Korea want to have the joint project and joint programs rather than being a receiving end regarding international aid. So there can be the possibility for collaborations and cooperations with North Korea and the international community. And also the inter-Korean cooperation can give a positive signal to NGOs who made effort in order to support North Korea. But while the North Korean sanctions, that becomes the stumbling block in this process. So the North Korean nuclear program gives a threat to the peace of international society. That's why international sanction has been imposed. But still, we do not have a viable outcomes out of that. We cannot just ask the responsibility to North Korea. So in the past, when we met the officials from the North Korea, what they said is actually international sanctions give some negative impact on North Korean economy, but it is important to have international cooperation so the North Korea can have the foundations to stand by themselves. As a member of the international community, North Korea wants to bear its own responsibility. That's what the officials from North Korea mentioned a few years ago when I met them. So, South Korea and the United States have the close the alliance, and actually we are on the nuclear umbrella, designed by United States. The nuclear weapons developed by the North Korea, that is a great threat to us, but we can actually make some the changes. So, North Korea want to develop their own economies through the joint the programs. So we should go beyond these international sanctions. And North Korea want to make some changes in their economic situations. That's why North Korea came to the negotiation table in the Hanoi. But there was a no deal from the Hanoi summit. That's why that gave the North Korea received a negative impact. So international sanctions want to give some negative impact on target country. So it is to penalize the target country. So the international society and the United States actually have the pin set. The sanctions, but in the process of international sanctions, the women's and the children's, those innocent people, they receive the negative impact indeed. So as we had the discussions in the first session, so before we talk about the effectiveness of international sanctions, we need to think about the international the humanitarian situations, because the innocent people they badly impacted from international sanctions. When you see humanitarian situations in North Korea, do we have to impose these international sanctions in continuous way? We should have the very cautious approaches regarding that. We cannot prove that, but the officials from the North Korea, and they share some information. So, we can get some glimpse about North Korean situations. North Korea has the difficult situations. And also, we cannot guarantee this information 100%. But according to some sources, there the hunger in the North Korea, and some actually die from hunger. So this is not quite the time which he picks the food shortages, but there well the news about that. So we need to take a very cautious approaches regarding North Korean situations. So the North Korean situation deteriorated, and that the situation is accelerated. That's why the NGOs and other civic groups take this situation very seriously, and we attentively watch what is going on in North Korea. The international sanction is not only on the North Korea, and these NGOs' activities has been restricted from these international sanctions. Well, the fundings and other the activities cannot be made for the North Korea. Well, there are various opinions regarding North Korean and the aid in these situations. But anyhow, due to international sanctions, the NGOs lost its engines for its activities, which is a very negative impact. So the universal values and mutual coexistence and those the key ideas pursued by NGO, the civic groups, but under these international sanctions, NGOs are losing its momentum and its the engines for activities. And also, it is important to build trust and confidence. In order to build trust and confidence, it is crucial to have the aid and assistance programs. Based on this, we have the better opportunities to build trust and confidence. But due to the international sanctions, we just lose the opportunities to build such the trust. Some the cooperative farms participated in order to have this the inter-Korean cooperations, but due to international sanctions, this cooperative farm program has been stopped. If we go back to North Korea in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, if we offer to resume our cooperation to cooperative farms, and it will not be easy. So the North Korea is the socialist country, so the organizations and individuals who involved in the international aid programs, they actually removed from the support the list from the North Korean government. So actually the cooperative farms have chosen to have international programs, so they could not receive the support from the North Korean government. So in that situation, in order to survive, in order to support this the cooperative farms and the relevant people, the international community and the South Korea should make great effort in order to keep the promise so that they can survive. But international community and the South Korea does not keep their promise, then and cooperative farms and the other organizations who decide to have international programs in the North Korea have a very difficult situation. The public and the private cooperation is crucial to provide support to North Korea. The trust and the confidence should be built on the private level first, and that can give the momentum to have the public and government level the cooperations. If there is no trust and no confidence on this human-to-human relations, then on the government level, it is even more difficult to build close relations and build trust and confidence. We need to make the positive contributions based on these the exchanges. But because international sanctions give a negative impact on building trust and confidence, that is a very unfortunate situations. So what I think is, the international sanctions against North Korea has some justifications and legitimacy, but I sincerely hope that this international sanction should not give a negative impact on innocent people like children and women, and also there should be decoupling between the aid and also the political the effort. And the Korean government and also NGOs in Korea should play leaderships in order to change situations. The information should be changed and should make a continuous effort. And also based on the various the programs and the effort, the NGOs in South Korea should make effort in order to change North Korea. The North Korean NGOs and South Korean NGOs, and they can have the exchanges. And I want to make a few suggestions. There is a pending issues that is the COVID-19 pandemic. It is crucial to provide the vaccines to North Korea. I'd like to actually ask a question to Professor Park Ki. So this COVID pandemic giving impact on the international community. Rather than we provide just the one-time the aid. So there's some COVID pandemics and climate changes, the international issues. So the health issues and also there's climate change issues, and those the common challenges faced by all of us. So we need to find the better options. So in order to safeguard ourselves, we need to provide the health support to North Korea. We need to provide the vaccines to North Korea. So what should be prepared? What is the proper options to support North Korea regarding that? So you the experts in health at the scenes, what is your suggestions then? Well, thank you so much. So we just heard from Secretary General Lee Joo-sung. Now, I also participated in the NGO activities to support North Korea. So there are great difficulties, UN sanctions and COVID-19, and also the economic difficulties. And North Korea have the three different challenges at the same time. So in this international sanctions, and NGOs and civic groups and lose their momentums to support North Korea, and also the trust and the confidence, and those have been broke down because there is no exchanges. So actually, we have a great the problems in the international the arena. So for the last the 4 years, we wanted to make some changes, but we are nearly the end of these the administrations. So anyhow, we are going to invite Professor Park Ki again. So if you have any the comments, please do share with us.
Chairman Kang, let me just comment on Director Tae-jin Jung's proposal, specifically as it relates to the U.S. government involvement in humanitarian aid, and specifically the USAID, perhaps opening up a liaison office or some branch office in North Korea. That's a really interesting concept because the USAID has been moved up. The USAID administrator, Samantha Power, is now part of the National Security Council. So even though it's administered within a State Department, her position, so international aid, is now considered part of the National Security Council agenda. So it's a very creative solution. I think it's an interesting idea worth exploring. Then the other question is from Secretary General Joo-sung Lee about vaccines in North Korea. So one of the things that we were able to find out is the actual capabilities of North Korean government in deploying vaccines. And they're able to deploy at times as many as 3 million injections a day. They did this about a dozen years ago for the measles outbreak, and they had a nationwide vaccination campaign. What that means is that they're actually able to deploy the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine, which have the highest safety profile and efficacy profile. So before, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines were not really an option for North Korea. They talked about AstraZeneca, the Sinovac, but I think there's a certain amount of vaccine hesitancy within North Korea. And I think it's worthwhile offering North Korea the mRNA vaccine, either Moderna or the Pfizer, through the COVAX advanced market commitment mechanism. Now, that only provides 20% of the population with subsidized vaccines. I think it's also time to evaluate the entire package. Maybe as many as 50 to 60 million doses of vaccine, perhaps Moderna, perhaps Pfizer, for the entire population of North Korea. I think they need to be assured that they will be able to vaccinate the entire population, and I think they will get their attention.
예, 우리
So, well, Professor Park actually shared his insightful ideas. So, thank you so much. So, the North Korean the population can have the herd immunities by having these the vaccinations. So, the support is required as a humanitarian issues from the perspective of North Korea. But well, rather than we only focus on that, we also have a broad the perspective. So, based on this effort, the inter-Korean and the North Korea, the United States relations can be developed further. So the Professor Park, your time is at 10 p.m. So thank you so much for joining us. So we need to have a short break in order to prepare the next session. So, well, at 10:55, we are going to resume our discussions. Once again, my sincere thanks go to Park. Good night.